Hello comrades, today I'm going to be doing a little video on the national question and basically trying to apply it to the current situation in Britain. The national question, at least the Marxist-Leninist understanding of it, it really started to be addressed by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. They basically applied it to the conditions of the old Tsarist Russian Empire, so like basically pre-revolutionary Russia. From then on, it has been addressed and used by many anti-imperialist national liberation movements across the Southern Hemisphere, and the national question to this day can still be applied to settler-colonial states like the US, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. I know that Stalin in particular, he did a lot of work on this topic himself, and he was seen as an expert within the Bolshevik party when it came to the national question. The main reason for this was because Stalin was Georgian, so he was from a minority and an oppressed nationality as well. Plus, he also did a lot of work in applying the national question to the situation of all the other minorities as well. He did a lot of work in the Trans-Caucasian area, so he was dealing with like Uzbeks, people from Azerbaijan, Georgians, Armenians and so forth. So Stalin was basically seen as an expert when it came to the national question, which was why he actually had a request from Lenin himself to write about the Bolshevik perspective on it and basically what the Bolshevik policy on the national question should be. Now, why was this so important to the Bolsheviks? Well, if you're not really familiar with Russian history, the Russian Empire, which existed before the Soviet Union, it was a tyrannical police state that was ruled by an absolute monarchy. The Russian Empire was also more commonly known in its time as the prison house of nations. It was basically this huge conglomeration of different nationalities, full of all kinds of different people with all kinds of different backgrounds. All of these nationalities were just completely subjugated and oppressed under the rule of the Russian Tsar. This meant that the only official language was Russian. So all of the other languages were basically trampled on and stamped out because the Russian language and the Russian culture were basically the only ones that were recognized. The same goes for the Russian religion, which was Orthodox Christianity. So anti-Semitism, Islamophobia and stuff like that was bloody rife in the Russian Empire. There were horrific massacres of Jews in particular, which were known as pogroms. And there were very similar massacres carried out against Armenians and Uzbeks as well. So the horrible things that were done to Jewish and Muslim communities in the Russian Empire can literally be compared to like the lynching of black people in the US. It was that bad. So none of the other cultural or ethnic groups within the Russian Empire had any cultural or political rights whatsoever. And of course, this sort of oppression ended up leading to the creation of lots of different nationalist movements. So what the Bolsheviks were doing was very timely indeed. They didn't just apply the national question to the conditions of the Russian Empire for the fun of it. They actually looked at what was going on and found ways to resolve the situation by basically integrating it into the class struggle as well. It's a little bit like what the Black Panthers were doing in the US. They were applying Marxism-Leninism to the situation in the US, but they also managed to address the issues of decolonization and the black liberation struggle as well by looking at the national question. So when we apply Marxism-Leninism to the national question, like the Bolsheviks and the Black Panthers did, we also have to look at the class forces at play in shaping the social and national development as well as the identity of nations. Now, when looking at Britain, many people overseas might not be too familiar with this, but while Britain is a country in itself, it would be more correct to look at Britain as a country that's made up of several countries. A lot of people overseas unintentionally make the mistake of associating Britain with just England. But in reality, there are not just English people in Britain. You've also got Scottish people, Cornish people, and Welsh people as well. This is where the national question comes in. There is also Northern Ireland, but the situation over in Ireland at the moment is entirely different to what's going on here on the mainland, because there's currently the anti-imperialist struggle of the Irish Republicans against the Unionists. And if you don't know who the Unionists are, they are basically British loyalists who essentially are supporting the British occupation of Northern Ireland. What's happening is that the Unionists are in Northern Ireland just massacring Republicans and their communities with the full backing of the British government. the media here in Britain, they always like to talk about an Irish border, when in reality there is no Irish border at all. There's actually just a British border that's dividing the Irish people. Britain basically enforced an imperialist partition and divided the country, similar to what the US did on the Korean Peninsula. In this video though, I'm mainly going to be focusing on Wales and Scotland when addressing the national question in Britain. But before I do that, I just want to read out a very famous quote by Stalin. And this very famous quote of his can be found in his book Marxism and the National Question. Basically, this quote of Stalin's gives the full definition of what a nation actually is. So let's take a look at what it says. Quote, "A nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture." Close quote. So clearly on this basis set out by Stalin, Scotland and Wales, just like England, are nations. But in order to start to understand how the national question has developed here, we have to delve into the history of these nations. Like most Western European nations, Scotland and Wales, like England, developed firstly from feudal nations into capitalist nations. The Welsh and the Scottish wars of independence against England leading up to the 14th and the 15th centuries, the English Civil War of the 1640s, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, and the rapid expansion of the British Empire that funded it, are all events which demonstrate the changing social, economic and political conditions that have shaped not just Scotland and Wales, but Britain as a whole. Then more recently in the 20th century, with decolonisation that came as a result of the struggles of communist-led national liberation movements during the Cold War, followed by the dissolution of the British Empire, along with the rolling back of the post-war social democratic consensus, which then paved the way to the destructive period of deindustrialization and around 40 years of unchallenged neoliberal hegemony, which has become famously known in Britain as Thatcherism, have all been events that led to the dramatic change of the social relations within this country. So when looking at the national question in Britain, the first thing you need to do is to recognize the default starting point in any communist's approach, which is, as Lenin argued, that all nations have the right to national sovereignty and self-determination. What this means is to recognize that nations have the right to choose their own paths and essentially control their own destiny. And this brings me to another subject entirely, because a lot of comrades here in Britain have asked me plenty of times whether I'd support Welsh and Scottish independence. But the truth is that I just don't have a simple yes or no answer, because there's a hell of a lot to consider when thinking about this. Now, while it's very important to recognise the right of the Welsh and the Scottish people to national sovereignty and self-determination, it's also vital to look at this from an internationalist perspective as well, to actually recognise that the class oppression that Welsh and Scottish workers go through can't just be blamed on the English. What's also just as important to this question is that we should not hold any pessimistic or reactionary views that Wales and Scotland are somehow too small or too backward to be independent nations. In fact, if Wales and Scotland had the economic and political strategies to serve the interests of working people, i.e. socialism, rather than to serve like national capitalists or bankers in Brussels, then they could definitely have the potential to thrive as independent nations. However, if the national question doesn't even try to address the issues which daily torment working people in Britain, namely a political and economic system that is deliberately set up to work only for the capitalist class, followed by the alienation that workers feel from their work, as well as the apathy that then inevitably leads to feelings of hopelessness, then it becomes practically meaningless for the working class. So when it comes to the national question in Britain, the question any communist should be asking is one of power. In other words, the national question must be presented along the lines of class struggle to actually have bearing and meaning, because it's through this that workers will then be faced with the choice to either fight against the power of capital that beats them down, or to do what the SNP in Scotland and Plaid Cymru here in Wales want to do, which is to just beat around the bush and make purely cosmetic changes. The next important thing to address is that Welsh, Scottish and English workers are all up against one common enemy, the big capitalists and the aristocracy. It is these parasites and their right-wing unionist lackeys in Parliament who make the decisions that impact all of us. So just like the average Welsh and Scottish worker, the average English worker also bears the brunt of neoliberal austerity, and English workers, like Welsh and Scottish workers, also have to sell their labour power to the capitalist class in order to live. But with that said, it is also important to take note that the campaigns led by Scottish and Welsh nationalist groups certainly do arise from very legitimate grievances against right-wing unionism. And if you're not so familiar with right-wing unionism in Britain, it essentially tramples on the democratic rights and seeks to suppress and wipe out the cultures and the languages of the people of Wales and Scotland. The development of the British state has led to a very unequal relationship between the different nationalities, because as the British state was developing, Scotland and Wales basically became subjugated under the rule of the British Crown and Westminster. This means that the Welsh and the Gaelic languages, along with the cultural and political rights of the Welsh and the Scottish people, have suffered quite considerably. And even though it's slightly better nowadays because we've got devolved parliaments in Wales and Scotland, there is still a very unequal distribution of wealth within Britain too, with much of it being hoarded in London and the southeast, which is basically the financial centre of British imperialism. This is combined with the current devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and occupied Northern Ireland not having enough power and being marginalised and overruled by Westminster as well. Nonetheless, the problems faced by Welsh and Scottish workers should not just be blamed on the English, because the actual culprit is capitalism. Capitalism is what actively creates the poverty and the alienation that has become the common lot of the workers of the world. And every institution in Britain is designed to protect the capitalist system that perpetuates the misery faced by Scottish, English, Cornish and Welsh workers alike. Therefore, the reality is that the average Welsh, Cornish and Scottish worker has far more in common with the average English worker than they do with any Welsh or Scottish politician. So the job of the communists should really be to reach out to Welsh and Scottish workers, particularly the politically backward ones who are quite nationalistic and resentful towards the English, and to basically show these workers and tell them, look, we're not against you guys, we're against our rulers. This makes it perfectly clear that the proletariat will only ever be liberated through overthrowing the capitalist system, destroying it entirely and building a socialist society to work towards building the necessary conditions for the disappearance of classes altogether. It's the class struggle that offers the solutions to the problems and the contradictions inherent to capitalism, and struggling for workers' power holds the key to overcoming these issues. The SNP in Scotland and Plaid Cymru here in Wales, however, despite their rhetoric, they both continue to support a fake independence which, if written into law, would leave the Scottish and the Welsh people even more at the mercy of multinational corporations and big global capitalists. And as communists, that's not the sort of thing we want to see for Wales or Scotland. And I can almost guarantee that many Welsh and Scottish workers will not be too enthusiastic about that either. Like, this is absolutely not to say, oh, Welsh and Scottish independence, nah, fuck that, and just totally write off the possibility of Wales and Scotland becoming independent at all, because the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, for instance, it produced a democratic result, and so will an independence referendum here in Wales, should there be one in the future. And these are decisions that should be respected, because after all, it's the right of the Welsh and the Scottish people to choose their own paths, even if the financial capitalists in London and the politicians in Westminster who serve them don't think so. So while breaking away from Britain may very well bring new opportunities to advance the struggle of working people in Scotland and Wales, and while I would not shed a tear for Britain if this were to happen, truth be told, if this were to actually happen, some new challenges and contradictions would also arise, and we'd at the very least be in the same position as we are now, so we'd face the same obstacles, as the Scottish and the Welsh states would still be dominated by a British ruling class. They'd still be within the confines of capitalism, and according to the plans of both the SNP and Plaid Cymru, they'd be under the jackboot of the European Union and NATO as well. So if there is to be any meaningful benefit to the working class in the event of independence, we would need a radical workers' government run in the interests of the Scottish and the Welsh working people, with the workers themselves constituting these nations, and we would need to see a huge injection of class politics into these mass movements in both countries, because it's the ultimate goal of any communist that the nation should be the workers and not the plaything of either national capitalists or big international capitalists either. So essentially the question of what's in the best interest of Scottish and Welsh workers when it comes to independence is not whether we are ruled by capitalists in Brussels, London, Edinburgh or Cardiff, but whether we will have the true and democratic freedoms that only socialism and workers' power can provide. Now, a tactic that catches my eye is federalism, as it's quite effective when addressing the national question in Britain. It's sometimes referred to as home rule, and it's kind of similar to what the Soviets did when they were trying to address the national question. In the Soviet Union, it made a lot more sense to basically recognize each nationality separately and give them their own republics, rather than to just build one big country with a massive conglomeration of nationalities within it, like the United States is today, for instance. That's why the Soviets created policies which helped Ukrainians, Belarusians, Moldovans, Kazakhs, Georgians, etc. to better preserve their own cultures and languages and exercise their cultural and political rights. Simply put, the strategy in Britain, much like what was seen in the Soviet Union, would basically be to go down the road of being a socialist federation of republics. So England would have their own republic, and so would Scotland, Cornwall and Wales. At the same time, much like the USSR, there would also be policies to help Welsh, Scottish and Cornish people to better preserve their own cultures and languages, because as we're seeing now, the current British government with its right-wing unionism is largely suppressing these different nationalities. And of course, this economic and political hegemony from the City of London is what has resulted in the massive nationalist movements in Wales and Scotland popping up. A socialist federation would basically put Scotland, Wales and Cornwall on an equal footing with England. It would also give each nation in Britain the maximum control over their countries and their own affairs, with their own devolved parliaments, rather than being totally subjugated to Westminster. The abolition of the monarchy would also be included within this as well. It would basically allow better decision making and an economic strategy that would better serve Scotland, Wales and Cornwall, whilst also facilitating the radical redistribution of wealth across Britain, particularly from the southeast of England and the City of London, where the majority of the country's wealth, as I said before, is currently hoarded by the capitalist class. English, Welsh, Scottish and Cornish workers all have a long history of resisting capitalism and striving for revolutionary change, and this is basically the cornerstone of the communist approach to the national question in Britain, because by organising on a British level, workers here will be able to more effectively resist the power of global financial capital, whereas simply going along with the SNP or Plaid Cymru simply because they're somehow less evil than the Tories, that won't actually achieve anything for workers, because the policies of Nicola Sturgeon and Adam Price would just tie us even closer to the imperialist bloc of the European Union, which of course will only suit the interests of bankers and multinational corporations. So we really can't abandon national identity to be picked up by nationalists and right-wingers. We've actually got to pick up that torch ourselves and lead the charge, because the fight for national sovereignty and self-determination both go hand in hand with the struggle for socialism, and that struggle is right here, right now.